You ever find yourself staring at a message you already wrote, rereading it over and over again, changing a word, then another, adding a bit more context just in case it gets taken the wrong way, then deleting everything and sitting there for another minute wondering if it still sounds right, even though what you originally meant was already clear in your own head? Because I've had more moments like that I can count, where something simple turns into something carefully managed and complicated, not because I didn't know what I wanted to say, but because I was thinking about how it would be received by the other person before it even left me. Like if I could just land on the right version of it, the perfect message, then it would finally come across the way I meant it to. And that's where it starts to get subtle, because it doesn't feel like overthinking at first. It feels like you're just trying to communicate properly, trying to avoid being misunderstood, trying to make sure nothing gets twisted into something you didn't intend. Yet if you slow it down even a little, you start to notice how much effort quietly goes into shaping something that was originally simple into something that feels safe enough to send. There's this pattern that doesn't really stand out while you're in it, because it doesn't look like anything extreme or obvious on the surface. It just feels like you're trying to be clear, trying to make sure what you're saying actually lands the way you mean it to. Yet the more you pay attention to it, the more you realize how often that thought process shows up, not just in messages, but in conversations, in small interactions, in moments where you pause just a second longer than you need to before saying something out loud. It shows up in those small, almost forgettable moments that add up over time, like staring at a message longer than you probably need to, rereading it a few times, changing one word because it feels too direct, or adding another because it might not be clear enough, taking something out because it could be misinterpreted, then putting it back in because now the message feels incomplete, until what you end up sending isn't just what you wanted to say, it's something that's been shaped around the possibility of how someone else might receive it. And I think a lot of us have been there without really calling it what it is. I've had those moments more times than I like to admit. Sitting there going back and forth with myself over something that should have taken 10 seconds to send, convincing myself that if I just phrase it the right way this time, or if I just land on the right combination of words and tone, then it'll finally make sense on the other side. They'll understand what I meant, they won't take it the wrong way, and everything will just land the way it was supposed to. Except it doesn't always land like that, or at least not in the way you expected it to, which is where something begins to shift, because now it's not just about expressing yourself anymore. It starts to feel like you're responsible for how it's received. Like the outcome depends on how well you manage every possible interpretation before it even reaches them. That's where it starts to get draining in a way that's hard to explain unless you've really noticed it in yourself, because you're no longer just speaking naturally. You're adjusting in real time, thinking ahead, predicting reactions, and trying to close every possible gap where something could be misunderstood, even though there's a part of you that already knows you can't fully control something that's interpreted once it leaves you. There have been moments where I walked away from a conversation feeling like I did everything right, at least in terms of how I said it, the tone, the wording, the timing, all of it felt considered, and yet something still didn't sit well afterward, like the version of what I said that existed in their head wasn't even close to what I meant, and I'd catch myself wanting to go back and explain it again just one more time, just a little clearer, like maybe I just missed something small. But that's actually where the loop starts to build without us really noticing it, especially if you've ever felt misunderstood before, because you begin to assume that the problem is how you're explaining things, not how the other person is choosing to hear them. So you keep refining, keep adjusting, keep trying to close that gap as if it's something you can eventually eliminate. At some point though, a different thought starts to come in, and it's not a comfortable one because it shifts the entire situation in a way that takes some control away from you, which is the idea that maybe it's not about explaining it better. Maybe it's not about finding the perfect wording or the perfect tone. Maybe the reason it isn't landing the way you want it to is because they already decided how they see it. Sitting with that feels different because it challenges that underlying belief that if you just get it right, everything will click. When in reality, people don't hear things in a neutral way. They hear them through their own perspective, their own assumptions, their own versions of who they think you are, which means you can say the same thing multiple times in multiple ways, and they might still arrive at the same conclusion. When that possibility isn't something you fully accepted yet, you end up stuck trying to fix something that isn't actually broken on your side. You just keep thinking it's because the outcome didn't change, so you go back, explain again, adjust again, and you hope that this time it'll finally be enough. I've had moments where I realized I wasn't even speaking the way I naturally would anymore. I was filtering everything mid-conversation, softening things that didn't need to be softened, over-explaining things that were already clear, just trying to remove any chance of being misunderstood. And by the end of it, it didn't even feel like what I said reflected what I actually meant. It just felt like a performance, like something that had been shaped, molded to be received a certain way. And that begs the question, quietly, almost in the background, from how do I say this better to something a little more honest and a little harder to ignore, which is, how much of myself am I changing just to be understood right now? There's a difference between expressing yourself clearly and constantly reshaping yourself so that no one can misunderstand you. And the more that you sit with that difference, the more you start to feel how much pressure comes from the second one, not just in big conversations, but in all these small moments where you pause, adjust, rethink, just to make sure everything comes across correct. The truth is, even if you get it exactly right, even if you say it in the clearest way possible, it still might not be received the way you meant it to, not because you failed to explain it properly, but because not everyone is open to understanding it in the way you see it. And that's not always something you can fix. Once that starts to settle in, even just a bit, something begins to change, not all at once, not in a big realization, but in smaller moments where you start to let go of that constant need to refine everything before it leaves you, where you start to recognize where your responsibility ends and where someone else's perception begins. You can communicate honestly, you can express yourself clearly, you can say what you mean, but you can't decide or control how it's received. And once you stop trying to control that part, there's a certain kind of relief that comes with it, even if it doesn't feel like much at first. It doesn't mean that you stop caring. It doesn't mean that you stop explaining things when it really matters. It just means you stop overextending yourself in situations where understanding was never really being offered in the first place. And that alone changes how you show up, how you speak, and how much of yourself you keep intact instead of reshaping it for the sake of being perceived a certain way. Because the people who are actually open to understanding you usually don't require that level of effort just to see you clearly. And the ones who don't, even after you've explained yourself more than once, probably aren't lacking explanation. They're just seeing you through something you don't control. That's something that I've come to terms with slowly, not all at once, not perfectly, but enough to realize that constantly trying to be understood by everyone was never really the solution. It just felt like control, even if it came at the cost of how naturally we were showing up in the process. Thanks for watching, Rardo, and I'll see you in the next video.